By late autumn in 1917, the ridge road through the pass in Idaho turned to ice before noon most days. The road ran narrow along a spine of rock between valley timber below and high country to the south, climbing through switchbacks carved into shale and frozen dirt. Coaches carried mail and passengers twice a week, hauling government post, supply orders, and people moving between the scattered mill towns. On one side of that road, the drop went straight down 300 feet into scrub pine and boulders the size of wagons. On the other side, cliffs rose bare and gray, streaked with old melt that had frozen into pale ribbons down the stone. Wind came through that gap like something with intention behind it. It knocked hats clean off men's heads, rattled the coach shutters hard enough to crack wood, and made the horses pull their ears back flat against their skulls and blow nervous air through their nostrils. Nora Elling rode ahead of the coaches on a gray pony with a white blaze down its nose. She was 19 years old that autumn, small-framed, quiet by nature, steady in the saddle the way some people are steady on their feet no matter what ground they're standing on. She carried the mail pouch strapped diagonally across her chest and rode out rain or shine to check the road ahead for rockfall, snowdrifts, washouts, anything that might stop a loaded coach or snap an axle in a place where help was half a day away on foot. The drivers trusted her completely. She knew every turn in that pass, every loose stone that shifted under weight, every place where ice formed first when temperature dropped at night. Her father worked the sawmill down in the valley, running the big blade that cut raw timber into boards. Her mother kept a boarding house on the edge of town where loggers and railroad men stayed between jobs, and where Nora helped serve breakfast in the mornings before she rode out. Nora had been riding that ridge road since she was 14 years old. She'd started helping her uncle, who ran mail before her, and took over the job herself when he moved south to work cattle. People in Idaho said she could read weather in the mountains better than men who'd lived there all their lives. She knew when snow was coming by, the way wind changed direction an hour before the first flakes fell. She knew which sections of road turned to sheet ice overnight and which stayed passable. She was careful, methodical, reliable. She'd never once failed to report back to the station after a ride. On the morning of November 9th, she rode out ahead of the southbound coach just after sunrise. The temperature sat well below freezing. The sky pressed down low and colorless over the peaks, heavy with the kind of weight that meant snow later but not yet. No storm, just cold. Just wind that tasted like metal and pine resin and carried the smell of rock dust from higher up where shale cliffs were always shedding thin fragments. Driver Calder Boone watched her go from the station yard, standing beside the coach with his hands tucked under his arms for warmth. He said later she turned in the saddle once, about 50 yards out, and lifted one hand in a brief wave. Casual. The pony's breath puffed white in the air. Then she nudged it into a trot and disappeared around the first bend where the road started climbing toward the switchback. The coach followed 20 minutes behind her. That was standard procedure, worked out over years of running that route. Nora checked the road, and if it was clear, the coach came through without delay. If she found trouble, a rock slide blocking passage, a bad drift, ice too thick to cross safely, she rode back down and told Boone to wait or turn around and try again the next day. It had worked that way for 5 years without incident. When Boone guided the coach around the base of the first switchback, Nora's pony came trotting back down the road toward him. Alone. Lathered white across the chest and flanks, breath coming hard and fast. Eyes rolling, showing white all around the edges. Reins hanging loose and dragging through the thin snow, the mail pouch still strapped to the saddle. Leather dry as kindling sitting on top of a patch of snow that steamed faintly in the cold morning air, as if something warm had just passed over it and left heat pooled there in defiance of physics. Boone pulled the coach to a stop and climbed down fast. The two passengers inside, a timber buyer and a woman traveling to visit family up the mountain, leaned out and asked what was wrong. He told them to stay inside and keep the door shut. Then he caught the pony's reins and called Nora's name up the road, loud enough that his voice should have carried a quarter mile in that thin air. The wind grabbed the sound and threw it off the cliff edge into nothing. He called again, waited, listened hard. Nothing came back except the hiss of wind over stone and the creak of the coach settling on its springs behind him. He tied the pony to the back of the coach and started walking up the road on foot, scanning both sides as he went. Snow lay thin and mostly unbroken except for the clear line of hoofprints running up the center and then coming back down. No boot prints anywhere. No sign Nora had dismounted. No scuff marks in snow along either edge. Just hooves, going and returning. 50 yards past the switchback, where the road straightened briefly before curving again, he found her scarf. It was looped warm over the top of a wooden milepost that marked distance from the valley station. The post stood frozen solid into the dirt, coated with a thin rime of frost along its base. The scarf sat draped neatly across the top, dark wool against pale wood, positioned as carefully as if someone had just pulled it off and set it there with both hands. Boone reached out and touched it. Warm. He stopped, pulled his glove off, and pressed his bare palm flat against the fabric. It felt like it had been wrapped around a living person's throat 10 seconds earlier. He could feel real body heat soaked into the fibers, radiating against his cold skin. He looked down at the snow around the post. No boot prints. No hoof prints close enough for someone to reach over from the saddle and drape a scarf without dismounting. No disturbance at all in the thin layer of snow covering frozen ground. Just the wooden marker, and the scarf, and air cold enough to steal warmth from anything in minutes. Then Boone turned toward the cliffside of the road and saw the line of prints climbing up from the edge into the snowdrift, pressed against the base of the shale wall. Boot prints, small, heel first. Every single one of them. Like someone had walked backward up a slope that angled 45 degrees toward vertical. The prints went up through loose powder for nearly 30 feet, clear and deliberate and impossible, and then ended abruptly on a wide sheet of bare shale where no snow clung and nothing could hold a person's weight. No body crumpled at the top. No blood streaked down rock. No fabric snagged on a stone edge. Just the sudden end of a trail that violated every law Boone understood about how people moved through the world. He stood there until his hands went completely numb inside his gloves and his face started to ache from cold. Then he walked back down to the coach, climbed up, turned the horses around, and drove hard back to the valley to bring help. They came back with 12 men by midday. Ropes, grappling hooks, 2 dogs trained for tracking lost people. Lanterns. Even though the sun was still well above the horizon and wouldn't set for hours. They spread out and walked that section of road shoulder to shoulder, marking every rock with chalk, checking every drift with long poles, examining every shadow and crevice in the cliff face for places a body might have wedged or fallen into. The dogs strained on their leads going up, noses low to the ground, pulling their handlers forward with clear purpose. Then both animals stopped dead in their tracks 20 yards past the milepost where Nora's scarf had been found. They sat down hard in the snow, ears pinned flat against their heads and whined high and continuous in their throats. The handlers tried to coax them forward. The dogs dug their paws in and refused to move. One of them started shaking so hard its collar jingled. The men searched for 2 full days. They dropped ropes over the drop side of the road and climbed down as far as the rock face allowed, swinging on belay lines, checking every ledge and outcrop they could reach. They probed snowdrifts with poles, feeling for anything solid underneath. They examined every crack and crevice in the shale wall where a person might have tried to climb or been dragged. They found absolutely nothing. No second scarf, no glove, no mitten, no shred of wool or cotton snagged on rock, no blood on stone, no body wedged in scrub pine 300 feet below. Nora's gray pony wouldn't go back up the road past the switchback for any reason. Every time someone tried to lead it up that section, it planted all 4 hooves in the frozen dirt and shook so violently, the saddle leather creaked. On the 3rd night after Nora disappeared, the coach company posted 2 guards at the small station house that sat just below the pass. One of them was Harlan Speck, who'd worked valley routes for 8 years. The other was younger, newer to the mountains. Around 2 in the morning, Speck woke to a sound outside. A whistle, 2 notes clean and distinct, the second one higher in pitch than the first. It came from somewhere below the road, out over the drop side where cliffs fell away into darkness. He sat up, pulled his boots on, and woke the other man. They both stepped outside into air cold enough to make their teeth ache and their lungs burn. They stood silent and listened. 10 minutes later, The whistle came again. Same 2 notes, low and clear, like someone signaling across distance to another person who wasn't answering. But there was no ledge out there past the road's edge. No trail cut into the cliff. No place for any living thing to stand and produce sound. At first light, Speck and the other guard roped themselves together and went down over the drop side as far as the stone allowed them to descend safely. They checked every surface they could reach. No marks in the snow that clung to lower ledges. No footprints, no disturbed rock. Nothing. A week after Nora vanished, the station clerk was updating the route ledger at his desk when he noticed something odd tucked between 2 pages near the back of the book. He pulled it out carefully. It was a small brass time tag, rectangular, no bigger than a man's thumb. The kind Nora carried in her coat pocket to mark inspection points along her route. She'd use a hand punch tool at each milepost to stamp the tag with the time. This tag was stamped clearly, 11:47 a.m. at November 9th. Nora Elling had ridden out from the station at 6:20 that morning. Boone found her scarf, still radiating body heat, on the milepost by 7:30. No one had seen her, spoken to her, or heard from her after she lifted her hand in that casual wave just past sunrise. The time tag should not have existed with that stamp on it. The clerk set it down on the desk surface and took 2 steps back. No one in that station wanted to pick it up barehanded or hold it for longer than necessary. People in Idaho still talk about Nora Elling when the subject comes up in certain rooms late at night, when wind rattles windows and the fire burns low. They don't mention her much during daylight hours. Men who drive coaches through that pass now, and there are fewer every year as the railroad takes over more routes, still refuse to ride it alone, even in summer when snow is gone and the road sits dry. The old hands tell the younger ones during their first week on the job, "You don't check that ridge road solo anymore, no matter how clear the sky looks or how calm the weather seems. And you don't ever answer if you hear 2 notes rising up from the drop side of the pass where no human being can stand." From November 1917 forward, every coach that ran the mountain pass route carried a rifle propped upright beside the driver's seat, just within arm's reach of whoever held the reins. Loaded, safety off. Not because anyone truly believed a rifle would stop whatever took Nora Elling off her pony in broad daylight and left her scarf warm on a frozen post, but because riding into that gap in the mountains without something solid and familiar in hand felt to every driver like stepping alone into a narrow room, where the door might swing shut behind you and the walls might move closer in the dark. The scarf sat in a locked drawer at the station house for 3 weeks after they found it. Then one morning in early December, the clerk opened the drawer to file a receipt and found the scarf folded differently than he'd left it, sitting on top of other items instead of underneath where he'd placed it. He was the only person with a key to that drawer. He touched the wool once quickly and felt faint warmth still trapped in the fibers, even though the drawer had been closed for days in a room that never got warm. After that, no one opened that drawer unless 2 people stood in the room together, and one of them kept eyes on the door. The timeline made less sense the more people tried to reconstruct it. Nora had left the boarding house at 5:50 that morning. Her mother saw her pull on her coat, wrap the scarf around her neck, and step out into the cold dark. The sky was still black, stars visible overhead. Nora walked down to the station, saddled the pony herself the way she always did, and signed the route log at 6:14. The station night clerk, a man named Paul Vickers, watched her ride out at 6:20. He said she looked the same as always, calm, ready, no hesitation. Calder Boone arrived at the station at 6:35 to prepare the coach. He saw Nora's signature in the log, fresh ink still wet. He hitched the team, loaded mail sacks, checked the brake. The 2 passengers arrived just before 7. Boone pulled out at 7:05, following the same route Nora had taken 45 minutes earlier. By 7:28, according to his pocket watch, he was rounding the base of the first switchback when the pony came back down alone. He found the scarf on the milepost at approximately 7:35. Warm, impossibly warm. But there was something else. A woman named Clara Dennison, who lived in a small cabin halfway up the valley road, told searchers she'd heard a whistle around 6:50 that morning. 2 notes. She was outside splitting kindling when she heard it, high and clear, coming from the direction of the pass. She thought it was Nora signaling back to the station about something on the road. Clara said it sounded close, maybe a quarter-mile up the slope. But if Nora had ridden out at 6:20 and the whistle came at 6:50, she should have been much farther up the pass by then, well beyond the switchback, out of earshot from the valley. Another man, a logger named Thomas Erskine, was walking the lower timber road that same morning before dawn. He said he heard the same two-note whistle, but he heard it twice. Once around 6:45, and again just after 7. He couldn't say exactly where it came from. Sound moves strange up there, he told the searchers. Could have been the ridge. Could have been lower. When they asked if it sounded like a person signaling, he paused. It sounded like someone answering, he said, but there was nobody to answer. The search party that went up on the 9th found the pony's hoofprints clear in the snow going up the road. They also found them coming back down. But between the two sets of tracks, there was a gap. A section of road about 70 yards long where the snow sat smooth and undisturbed, as if the pony had lifted off the ground and come back down farther along. The men checked that section 3 times. No hidden prints, no wind-scoured patches that might have erased marks. Just 70 yards of road where nothing had passed, even though the pony clearly went up and came back down. They spread out wider on the second day. 20 men this time pulled from the mill, the rail yard, farms along the valley. They walked shoulder to shoulder up and down that stretch of road, tying strips of red cloth to fence posts and rocks to mark sections already searched. Dogs worked the cliffside and the drop side, noses low. The handlers kept them on short leads. Both dogs behaved strangely. They'd pull forward, eager, and then suddenly stop and back up, whining. One of them urinated where it stood, ears flat, staring at nothing. Around midday on the second day, a young man named Peter Caro was checking the shale wall about 100 yards above the milepost. He called out. The others came over. He pointed at a small dark shape wedged in a crack in the rock, about 8 feet off the ground. One of the men climbed up and pulled it free. It was Nora's left glove. Wool, gray, with a small darn near the thumb her mother had sewn 2 weeks earlier. The glove was dry, clean, no dirt, no scuff marks. It sat in that crack as if someone had placed it there carefully, not as if it had been torn off or dropped. But here was the problem. The search party had walked past that section of wall the day before. Multiple men swore they'd examined that exact crack. It had been empty. Now the glove was there, visible, unmissable. They stood in a circle around Peter Caro and stared at the glove in his hand. Nobody wanted to say out loud what they were all thinking. The older hands in Idaho started telling the younger ones to stay in pairs. "You don't go up there alone," one of them said that night back at the station house. "Not to check road, not to look for her. 2 men minimum, eyes on each other." It wasn't an official rule. It didn't need to be. The men understood. On the 3rd day, they brought in a man from the next valley who'd worked search and rescue in the mountains for 15 years. His name was Albert Good. He'd found lost miners, missing children, hunters who'd wandered off trail. He walked the road slowly, studying everything. He examined the backward boot prints in the drift. He held Nora's scarf, then set it down quickly. He looked at the glove. He asked to see the brass time tag that had appeared in the ledger. When they showed it to him, he turned it over in his palm once, handed it back, and walked outside without speaking. Later, standing near the coach with Boone, Good said quietly, "I've pulled bodies out of snowpack and found men dead from cold 30 feet from their own camps. I've seen what animals do, and I've seen what accidents look like." He paused. "This isn't that." Boone asked him what he thought it was. Good shook his head. "I think you should keep men off that road after dark, and I think you should stop asking me questions I can't answer." The search went on for another 4 days. They covered every inch of accessible ground within a mile of the milepost. They dropped weighted lines over the drop side to check for ledges hidden below the rim. They climbed the shale wall as high as ropes would take them. They walked the timber below the road, searching for any sign she might have fallen or been dragged. They found nothing. No fabric, no blood, no second glove, no boot, no body. But small things kept happening. On the 5th day, One of the red cloth strips tied to a fence post appeared on a different post, 50 yards down the road. The man who'd tied it originally, a ranch hand named Samuel Oates, was certain of where he'd placed it. He'd tied it himself, double-knotted, at chest height on a post near a particular boulder. Now it was tied to a post farther south, same knot, same height. No one admitted moving it. On the 6th day, 2 men checking the area just after dawn smelled smoke. Not wood smoke, something sharper, metallic, like heated iron. They searched for a source. No campfire, no discarded cigar, no smoldering cloth. The smell lingered for 10 minutes near the milepost where the scarf had been found, then faded completely. On the 7th day, a piece of paper appeared wedged under a small stone on the road surface 20 yards past the milepost. One of the searchers spotted it and called the others. The paper was a corner torn from a route inspection form, the kind Nora carried in her coat. Written on it in pencil, in handwriting that looked like hers, were 3 words: "Check north fence." Her mother was brought up to look at it. She stood in the cold, hands shaking, and said, "That's her writing." But Nora's route didn't include any fence line to the north. There was no north fence anywhere near that section of pass. The men walked north anyway, checking every inch of ground. Nothing. People in town started saying different things. Some said Nora had run off, staged the whole thing, left the scarf and glove herself for reasons no one could guess. Others said she'd been meeting someone secretly and it had gone wrong. A few said she'd fallen and the body would turn up in spring when the snow melted, but none of those explanations fit the scarf still warm on frozen wood, or the time tag stamped hours after she'd vanished, or the glove appearing in a crack that had been empty the day before. The whistle was heard 3 more times during the search, always at night. Always the same 2 notes, once from the direction of the drop side, once from somewhere higher up the shale cliff, once from the direction of the valley, below the station. Different men heard it on different nights. None of them could agree on where it came from, only that it was clear, deliberate, and sounded like a signal waiting for a response that never came. By the 10th day, there was nowhere left to walk that didn't already hold their boot prints, and still nobody had found Nora Elling. The search was called off officially, though a few men kept going up on their own for weeks after. The coach company posted notices in 3 towns asking for any information. Nothing came back. Calder Boone kept driving the route, but he refused to go through the pass alone. The company assigned a second man to ride with him every trip, armed, sitting up top with a rifle across his knees. Other drivers did the same. It became standard procedure without anyone writing it down as policy. You didn't ride that pass solo. Not anymore. The last organized search party went up on the evening of the 14th day, just before sunset. 6 men. They walked the road one final time, silent, checking the milepost, the shale wall, the drop side. As they turned to head back down, one of the men, a mill worker named Howard Liss, heard something behind him. He stopped. The others stopped. They all heard it. Footsteps, light, quick, coming up the road from the south. They turned. The road was empty. The footsteps continued for 4 or 5 seconds, clear against frozen ground, and then stopped abruptly. The men stood in a line across the road, breath puffing white in the cold air, staring at nothing. Nobody spoke. They walked back down to the station together, stayed close, and didn't look behind them. After that, people in Idaho stopped searching, but they started listening. By the 3rd week, the search had become something else. Not an organized effort to find a missing person, but a kind of ritual the community performed to prove they hadn't given up. Men still went up to the pass, but they weren't looking for Nora anymore. They were looking for proof that the world still made sense. They didn't find it. Nora's mother, Ellen Elling, kept a vigil at the boarding house. She set a place for Nora at the table every morning. She washed Nora's spare clothes and hung them to dry. She refused to pack away Nora's belongings or speak about her daughter in past tense. The women in town brought food, sat with her, said nothing useful because there was nothing useful to say. Ellen's husband went up to the pass every day for 3 weeks, walking the same sections of road over and over, and came back every night empty-handed and silent. The coach company kept running the route, but ridership dropped. People didn't want to cross that pass anymore, even in daylight, with armed men on the driver's bench. The few passengers who did ride sat tense and quiet, watching the road through the window gaps, flinching at shadows. Drivers reported that horses balked at the switchback now, every time, and had to be coaxed forward with voice and rein. Animals knew something was wrong there. They always knew first. The brass time tag stamped 11:47 a.m. became an object no one wanted near them. The station clerk had placed it in a small wooden box and put the box on a shelf in the back office. On the morning of November 24th, 15 days after Nora disappeared, the clerk opened the box to show it to a railroad inspector who'd come asking questions. The box was empty. He searched the office, searched the shelves, asked everyone in the station if they'd moved it. No one had. The tag was gone. 2 days later, a coach driver named Frank Heston was checking the road before dawn, riding with another man as required. They stopped at the milepost where Nora's scarf had been found. Heston dismounted to adjust his saddle. When he put his hand on the saddle horn, he felt something small and cold under his palm. He lifted his hand. Sitting on the leather, directly where his hand had just been, was the brass time tag. Same stamp. Same date. 11:47 a.m., November 9th. Heston didn't touch it. He called the other man over. They both stared at it. The other man, a younger ranch hand named Joel Pinker, said, "That wasn't there a minute ago." Heston nodded. They left it sitting on the saddle and rode back down to the station without speaking. When they arrived and dismounted, the tag was gone again. After that, people stopped trying to hold on to objects connected to Nora. The scarf stayed locked in the station drawer, but no one opened that drawer anymore. The glove found in the shale crack was placed in a cloth bag and stored in a cabinet. The torn paper with "Check North Fence" written in her handwriting was pinned to a board in the station office for 2 days, then disappeared. No one admitted taking it. No one went looking for it. Theories spread through town the way sickness spreads, quiet and persistent. Some people said Nora had enemies. A man she'd refused to marry. Someone angry about a debt her father owed. But no one could name names, and no one could point to evidence. It was just talk, the kind that filled silence when silence became unbearable. Others said the land out past the ridge had always been strange. Old hunters told stories about game trails that appeared and vanished, about elk found dead in clearings with no marks on them, about sections of forest where birds didn't sing. "The past doesn't give back what it takes," one old man said in the mill yard. No one argued with him. A few people, the ones who wouldn't say it loudly or in daylight, whispered that it wasn't a man who'd brought Nora's pony back down the road with the mail pouch dry and the saddle still warm. They didn't say what they thought it was. They just said it wasn't a man. On December 1st, a Sunday, the church in the valley held a service for Nora. Not a funeral. A service of hope, the pastor called it. Ellen Elling sat in the front pew, silent, hands folded in her lap. Her husband sat beside her, staring at nothing. The church was full. People came from neighboring valleys, from camps up in the timber, from towns along the rail line. The pastor spoke about faith, about trusting that God held Nora wherever she was. He didn't say whether he believed she was alive or dead. No one knew what to believe anymore. After the service, a group of men gathered outside in the cold. They talked quietly about what should be done. Someone suggested marking the road, putting up a warning sign. Someone else said the company should close that route permanently, send coaches the long way around through the lower pass. Calder Boone, standing with his arms crossed, said, "You close that road, you're saying it won, whatever it is." They didn't close the road, but they changed how they used it. From December forward, no coach ran the pass after 3 p.m. in winter or after 6 p.m. in summer. Drivers were instructed to travel in pairs always, with at least one armed man on the bench. If weather looked uncertain, the run was delayed or canceled. The rules weren't written down in any company manual. They were passed from driver to driver, old hands to new, the way knowledge about dangerous ground always travels. You learned it your first week, and you didn't question it. Children in the valley started hearing the story from their parents. Not the full story, a version shaped for young ears. A girl went missing on the Ridge Road. Stay away from there. Don't wander past the fence line. If you hear someone whistle, don't whistle back. The children absorbed the rules without understanding why. By the time they were old enough to ask questions, the rules had become instinct. On December 10th, exactly 1 month after Nora vanished, a light snow fell in the valley. That evening, a woman named Margaret Coulter was walking home from the general store just after dusk. She lived on the south edge of town, near where the valley road started climbing toward the pass. As she walked, she heard a sound behind her. Footsteps, light, quick. She turned, no one there. The footsteps continued for a few seconds, then stopped. She walked faster. The footsteps came again, keeping pace behind her. She didn't turn around a second time. She walked straight to her house, went inside and locked the door. She told her husband, who went outside with a lantern and checked the road. Fresh snow lay smooth and unbroken. No prints except Margaret's. 3 nights later, the night clerk at the coach station, Paul Vickers, was alone in the office doing paperwork. Around 11 p.m., he heard the door to the back storage room open. He called out, "Who's there?" No answer. He stood up, walked to the doorway, and looked inside. The room was empty. The door, which had been latched shut, stood open. He closed it, checked the latch, went back to his desk. 10 minutes later, he heard it open again. Same sound. Hinges creaking. He didn't get up the second time. He sat at his desk, finished his work by lamplight, and left the building as soon as his shift ended. He never worked a night shift alone again. The whistle was heard sporadically through December and into January. Always at night, always 2 notes, sometimes from the pass, sometimes from lower in the valley, sometimes from directions that made no sense, like inside the timber where no trails ran. People stopped investigating when they heard it. They closed their doors, pulled their curtains, and waited for it to stop. By midwinter, the story of Nora Elling had settled into the bedrock of local culture. It wasn't something people talked about with strangers or brought up casually. It was something you learned if you lived there, the way you learned which wells had good water and which roads washed out in spring. The Ridge Pass was dangerous now, not because of rock slides or weather, but because of something no one could name. You respected that danger. You followed the rules. You didn't ride alone. You didn't go up after dark. You didn't answer whistles, and you didn't touch the brass time tag if it appeared again, which it did occasionally, over the years that followed. Drivers would find it sitting on a fence post, on the mile post, on a saddle horn, always in daylight, always when no one was looking. It would sit there for a few minutes or a few hours, stamped with that impossible time, and then it would be gone. No one picked it up anymore. No one tried to keep it or destroy it. It existed outside the rules they understood, and they had learned, slowly and painfully, that some things cannot be controlled or explained. They can only be endured. In February, Ellen Elling finally packed away Nora's belongings. She folded the clothes, put them in a trunk, and carried the trunk to the attic. She stopped setting a place at the table. She stopped waiting by the window in the evenings. But she never said her daughter was dead. When people asked gently if she'd accepted what happened, Ellen would look at them and say, "I accept that she's gone. I don't accept that I'll ever know where." It was the closest anyone came to speaking the truth out loud, that Nora Elling hadn't died in any way the world recognized, and that the world, at least the small piece of it around that ridge pass in Idaho, had become a place where the impossible sat quietly alongside the ordinary, and no one knew how to separate the two anymore. Years passed. The ridge road through the pass in Idaho stayed open, but it changed. The coach company built a second station house halfway up the route, a small shelter where drivers could stop, rest the horses, and wait out weather. No one stayed there overnight. The building had a stove, a bench, supplies stored in a locked chest, but no beds. There was an unspoken understanding that you didn't sleep in that shelter. Even if darkness caught you on the road, you pushed through to the valley or you turned back. You didn't stay. By 1920, the railroad had expanded service through the lower valleys, and coach traffic through the pass dropped to once a week, then twice a month. Automobiles started appearing on mountain roads, but drivers avoided the ridge pass. The road was narrow, the turns sharp, and there were easier routes that didn't carry the weight of what had happened there. The few people who did drive through went in pairs during daylight, and they didn't stop except for mechanical trouble. If they had to stop, they stayed in the vehicle with the engine running. Nora's parents left the valley in 1921. Ellen couldn't stay in the boarding house anymore. Every morning she woke up and looked at the road climbing toward the pass, and every morning the weight of not knowing pressed down harder. They moved south to a town near the state line where no one knew the story. Ellen lived another 18 years and never spoke her daughter's name aloud again. When she died in 1939, she was buried next to a small headstone that read, Nora Elling, 1898-1917, beloved daughter. There was no body beneath it, just earth and a marker, and the hope that naming the loss might make it easier to bear. It didn't. Calder Boone kept driving coaches until 1924, when the company finally shut down the Ridge route permanently. He moved to Oregon and worked freight lines there. He never talked about what happened on November 9, 1917, except once, late in his life, when a grandson asked him about the scar on his hand. Boone said he'd gotten it from a fall on a mountain road. Then he'd paused and added, I found something up there once that I wasn't meant to find. It was still warm when it should have been frozen. That's all I'll say. He died in 1951. At his funeral, his daughter found a small wooden box in his belongings. Inside was a strip of red cloth, the kind used to mark fence posts during searches. She didn't know what it meant. She burned it. The Ridge Road itself was abandoned by the state in 1928. Parts of it washed out during spring runoff. Rock slides blocked sections no one bothered to clear. By 1935, the road was impassable to vehicles. Hikers still used parts of it in summer, but local people warned them not to go up there alone and not to go at all after 4 p.m. The warnings were vague, couched in talk about unstable ground and weather, but the meaning underneath was clear. The land didn't follow rules up there. You respected that or you took your chances. In 1942, during the war, the Army considered using the pass for a supply route and sent surveyors to assess the road. 2 men went up on a clear August afternoon to map the terrain. They came back down 3 hours later, pale and quiet. They reported that the road was unsuitable for military use due to grade and deterioration. They didn't mention that they'd both heard footsteps following them on a section of road where no one else was present, or that they'd found a brass time tag sitting on a flat rock near the old milepost, stamped with a date from 1917. They pocketed the tag, walked another 100 yards, and threw it off the cliff edge into the drop below. When they got back to their vehicle and checked their packs, the tag was inside one of them, tucked into a side pocket neither man had opened. They left it on the ground beside the truck and drove away. The road was marked unsuitable, and the Army built their route through the southern pass instead. Children growing up in the valley during the 30s and 40s heard the story of the mail girl as a cautionary tale. Parents didn't tell it to scare them exactly. They told it to teach a rule. Don't go up to the ridge alone. Don't trust that road, even when it looks safe. Don't answer sounds you can't identify. The children learned these rules the way they learned not to touch hot stoves or wander into deep water. By reflex. By fear absorbed so young it became part of their bones. In 1956, a teacher from Boise brought a class of high school students to the valley on a field trip to study mountain ecology. One of the students, a boy named Michael Corman, asked a local shopkeeper about hiking trails in the area. The shopkeeper, an older man who'd lived there his whole life, mentioned several good trails, then paused and said, "Don't take the old ridge road up to the pass." Michael asked why. The shopkeeper looked at him for a long moment and said, "Because people in Idaho don't go up there alone, and people from outside Idaho don't know enough to be careful." He didn't explain further. Michael and 2 classmates hiked a different trail. They stayed together the whole time. The brass time tag continued to appear sporadically over the decades. A hiker found it in 1963, sitting on a stone beside the remnants of the old milepost, which had rotted and fallen years earlier. A surveyor doing geological work found it in 1971, lying in the center of a trail junction where he'd walked past twice already that morning. A young couple camping illegally near the pass in 1979 woke up to find it placed neatly on top of their folded map outside the tent. Every time the tag carried the same stamp, 11:47 a.m., November 9, 1917. Every time people left it where it lay or threw it away. And every time, eventually, someone else found it again. The two-note whistle was still heard occasionally, though less frequently as the years went on and fewer people traveled that stretch of mountain. In 1968, a Forest Service ranger doing a survey heard it clearly on a cold October morning and marked it in his report as unidentified wildlife call, possibly echo phenomenon. He noted the time, 11:47 a.m. When he realized what he'd written, he crossed it out and wrote approximately noon instead. He finished his survey route that day and requested a transfer to a different district a week later. By the 1980s, most of the people who'd known Nora Elling personally were dead. The story survived in fragments, old newspaper clippings in the county library, a mention in a regional history book published in 1977, occasional talk among longtime residents when the subject of strange disappearances came up. But the rules survived more completely than the story. People in Idaho, especially those living near the old pass, still followed them without always knowing why. You didn't hike that area alone. You didn't camp there overnight. You didn't investigate strange sounds. If you found something that didn't belong, a piece of brass, a strip of cloth, a glove tucked into a crack in the rock, you left it alone and moved on. In 1998, a journalist from a regional magazine traveled to the valley to research unsolved disappearances in Idaho history. She interviewed several elderly residents. Most were reluctant to talk in detail. One woman in her late 80s finally said, "You're asking the wrong question. You want to know what happened to Nora Elling. The real question is what didn't happen. She didn't fall. She didn't run. She didn't leave anything behind that made sense. And the land up there didn't give her back." The journalist asked what she thought had taken Nora. The woman shook her head. "I think something noticed her, that's all. And once it noticed, she couldn't leave." The article was never published. The journalist's notes mentioned that she'd felt persistently uneasy during her visit and had chosen to focus on other cases instead. In 2003, the State Parks Department placed a historical marker near the base of the old Ridge Road. It read, "Ridge Pass Coach Route, 1887-1928. This road served as a vital link between valley settlements and mountain communities, abandoned due to terrain instability and decline in coach travel. There was no mention of Nora Elling. Local residents had requested that her name not appear on the sign. They said it wasn't respectful to turn her disappearance into a tourist curiosity. But the truth, which they didn't say out loud, was that naming her there felt like an invitation, like calling attention to something that should be left alone. The Ridge Pass is still there. The old road is barely visible now, reclaimed by scrub and weathered stone. Hikers occasionally stumble onto sections of it and follow it for a while before the trail fades. Some of them report odd experiences. A feeling of being watched. Footsteps behind them that stop when they stop. A sense that they should turn around and leave, even in full daylight under clear skies. Most of them listen to that sense. The ones who don't usually leave anyway after they hear the whistle. Two notes, low and clear, coming from a direction where no person stands. There are three versions of what happened to Nora Elling on November 9, 1917, and people in Idaho will tell you all three depending on who's asking and what time of day it is. The first version is human. Someone had a reason to harm her. A rejected suitor, a business dispute, something personal and cruel. They intercepted her on the road, killed her, hid the body so well it was never found, and staged the scene to look inexplicable. This version appeals to people who need the world to make sense, who need violence to have motive and bodies to stay where they fall. The second version is natural. She had an accident, fell in a way that defied the search, or was taken by an animal that left no tracks, or suffered some sudden medical event that sent her off the road into terrain no one thought to search. The strange details, the warm scarf, the backward prints, the time tag, the whistle, are coincidence, misremembering, or the result of stress and fear warping perception. This version appeals to people who trust that nature, however harsh, still follows rules. The third version is the one nobody in Idaho says out loud, unless they've had enough whiskey or enough years to stop caring about being thought foolish. This version says that something lives in that pass, or moves through it, or waits there. Something that doesn't follow the rules human beings understand. Something that noticed a young woman riding alone on a cold November morning, and took her out of the world in a way that left traces but no body, questions but no answers, heat where there should have been cold, and time stamped on brass after time had already run out. Which version makes sense depends on what you're willing to believe. Which version people in Idaho actually believe depends on whether they've spent time near that ridge, heard the whistle, found the tag, or felt the weight of something watching from the drop side of the road where nothing can stand. Most of them won't tell you which version they hold closest. But if you watch how they move through that landscape, in pairs, never alone, not after dark, not answering sounds they can't explain, you'll know. The rules are still taught. Parents still tell children. Old hands still tell young ones. You don't go up there solo. You don't stay after sunset. You don't pick up objects that shouldn't exist. And if you hear 2 notes rising from the mountain, you don't whistle back. These rules have kept people safe, or at least kept them from joining Nora Elling wherever she went, for more than 100 years now. No one in Idaho is interested in testing whether the rules still work. Some knowledge is expensive. The people who live near that pass have already paid enough to learn what they know. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.